Welcome to Hype Hazard, your source for exposing the tech behind the hype. Today's technology landscape is full of buzz and cash, but it's also full of trash.
In our show, we'll cut through the flash and all too much FOMO, helping you navigate the hazardous data conditions ahead and sidestep way too much marketing wizardry to uncover where the real opportunities lie.
So if you are a pragmatic innovator, a cautious explorer, or a discerning executive, then this podcast is for you. Before we jump into the tech du jour, though, let us introduce ourselves. I'm Jamie Szymanski.
And I'm Jessica Grootman, and we are both technology analysts and founders at Kaleido Insights. We've spent our careers researching new, disruptive technologies and how they impact us all, consumers, businesses, and society at large.
And we have seen plenty of BS along the way, but also many gems that have truly changed life and work as we know it. So in Hype Hazard, we'll share our decades of experience with you critical thinkers, to help you understand new hyped up technologies for what they really are.
Now, spoiler alert, guys, they're usually terrible.
Yes, they're typically trash.
So with that, let's get into it. Today, we are going to be talking about Kahoot. And you have to say it with an exclamation point because it literally has an exclamation point.
Kahoot!
Kahoot! And the entire EdTech market, education technology market. So what is Kahoot?
We can't keep that up, you know that.
I'm sorry, I have to. I'm so excited. You can't not be. So this is a game-based learning platform. And when I say game-based, think quizzes. Big push on gamification, but the fundamental goal here for them is social learning, since in Kahoots. So this is a game show meets video game. There's countdown music. It feels like kind of an arcade. You get a gong at the end. But ultimately, this is about quizzes and using quizzes to enable learning. Now, what's really interesting here is that this is primarily a user-generated platform. So teachers and students and businesses and anyone can create quizzes, all sorts of different quizzes, single select, multiple select, choose the right order, puzzles, polls, open-ended. It's really simple. You get a pin for each quiz, you enter that pin on their website, and voila, there you are.
Reminded me sort of bar trivia. I don't know about you. You sit down somewhere and you have the little thing at your table. It reminds me a lot of that.
That's great. This is cool because it's kind of a hat tip to the old school arcade days. Also, folks who go to the bar, adults, right? We hope.
Yes, but perhaps you're right. 21 and plus only.
But this certainly is very user-friendly to anyone. By the way, speaking of user-friendliness, it's available on web and apps in person via collaboration tools like Zoom, Google Hangouts that we all know all too well. It's available in many different languages, tons of different templates. You can adjust all sorts of different pieces, music, how long it takes, the points that you distribute, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what's also interesting here is that they've really developed the platform around different personas. So I mentioned a second ago, businesses, but also anyone can participate. So there's a whole section designed for home, for parents, for kids who want to play with each other. For me and you, Jamie, I sent you a quiz the other day.
You sure did.
We won't get into that one. For teachers, of course, primarily in the primary first user base is for schools and educational institutions, but also for business. This has been a big growth area for them in recent years. So there's a whole kind of user base around, trainers and employee development, employee engagement. But fundamentally, this is a game-based, gamified learning platform designed for any kind of learning, for any age of learning.
Absolutely. And I think for purposes of this discussion today, we'll probably zero in more on the EdTech component of it. I see Kahoot being used most often K through 12. However, there are some interesting, college, university use cases as well. So your point, you suggest, in the enterprise sector as well. I mean, right now, there are 1.3 billion active users, billion with a B, of Kahoot, and over 100 million games. Now, most of these games are created by users themselves, like you say, and by games, I mean they're little quizzes. And the company itself is valued at 1.4 billion. So it's one of the biggest players right now in the ed tech space. And why is it so hyped up? That's a good thing to ask, because really at its surface level, the way you've described it was great. It's quizzes, right? It reminds me of trivia. But teachers have always been searching for new ways to engage their students students and to excite their students. And nowadays, involving new forms of technology and getting on the same level as the technologies that your students are using, that's simply table stakes. So a tool like Kahoot has been incredibly popular for in-person learning prior to the pandemic. And during the pandemic, then they had to adjust a little bit of their strategy in order to continue their growth trajectory, which they did well. They've integrated with Zoom, which makes a lot of sense as a lot of classrooms went online or even now are in hybrid learning. So I thought that was great. They've integrated with Microsoft Teams, which is wonderful for the enterprise level, as well as a lot of universities now are also using Teams as part of college courses, which I find interesting. So they've definitely found a way through some of their more premium tools to continue the online learning environment to feel the same as if you're doing a Kahoot with your class live. Now, there wouldn't be so much hype over Kahoot if it didn't work, right? So we talk about that a lot in Hype Hazard. In terms of the hype, typically only is there if it's effective. So a lot of studies have been done about Kahoot and the effects on learning performance. And the main conclusion, all the studies that I've reviewed and thinking about Kahoot prior to today's discussion have found that it really does have a positive effect on learning. It has a positive effect on classroom dynamics, on attitudes, and interestingly enough, on anxiety. Now, this was one of the things that I found counterintuitive. So when thinking about how it feels to be part of a quiz, I think way back, 20, 30 years ago when you had to take a lot of quizzes in school or even a trivia night, and they're usually pretty filled with anxiety. But interesting enough, a study from Science Direct showed that, the majority of students surveyed said that they were typically afraid to ask questions in class compared to when they played Kahoot. It was much easier for them. It reduced their anxiety by playing Kahoot in class, especially for those students that might be, scared to speak out or say the right answer in front of the rest of the class. So I found that pretty interesting. Other studies have shown that there have been great improved academic results compared to non-traditional teaching approaches. And really, I think it's that gamification component that you mentioned as well, Jess. And gamification, in and out of education, particularly though when studying it for K to 12, it can improve attendance. It's less late arrivals to class. I guess people are just rushing through the hallways to get to that Kahoot. And then also higher downloads of course materials, improved classroom dynamics, and even higher final grades. So I found it really interesting to look at the myriad of positive impacts, some of which, as I said, were a little bit counterintuitive for me as an adult to think about what this might be like to be quizzed in class in this way. It's also efficient for teachers, too. So Kahoot is a really great way to quickly, take a spot check on knowledge absorption in class, as well as to enter that data in that quiz category of a grade book. So I think that educators really have found this as a fun way to engage students, but also it's more efficient and it's a time saver for them as well. I think one important thing to chat about, though, and I think this can be looked at as both a positive and a negative, and I'd be curious what you think as well, Jess, in terms of the structure of these quizzes. So as you alluded to, they're usually multiple choice quizzes, and you take them, you enter in your answer, you usually use your real name in a classroom setting, and you are awarded points for getting it correct. Now, typically, this enforces learning that is done quickly and knowledge absorption that is also quick. So repetition is key, multiple choice questions are key, and memorization is key, as well as quickness in a competitive environment. So as you can imagine, depending on the type of, knowledge that you're trying to impart on your students, this could be good or bad, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, Jamie, this gets to one of the kind of big questions and maybe hazards looking at this platform. Do we want learning to be more competitive than it is collaborative? Now, there's a lot to kind of dig into here. One is this question of, first of all, is competition and competitive learning the best form of learning given all the different learning styles that are out there? Never mind within the dynamic of distance learning, how much easier that is to sort of feel isolated, to not necessarily, feel encouraged with every time you lose. That can compound over time. But also, and this is really important, something we talk about a lot kind of in the broader, future of work and skills development thread, what are the most effective emergent skills that kids need to be learning? It's not necessarily taking quizzes, I mean,
Right.
not to do away with that or throw the baby out with the bathwater, but how can we incorporate more design skills, more social skills, more problem solving, more applied thinking, more systems thinking? These
Mm-hmm.
are, in many ways, all the ones I just listed are much more about collaborative learning and collaborative problem solving.
Right, rather than pitting students against each other. I mean, it's
Exactly.
that's what I feel about Kahoot. I think it could be fun, right? In some capacities, we didn't have anything like that when we were growing
We
up.
just had Blackboard.
It could be cool in that way. Has the right use cases, I guess, but to me, it doesn't seem like a big thinking option. It measures breadth, perhaps, but not depth of knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah, very well put. And of course, when the metric for success is speed, it becomes much more about memorization, which is not the same thing as knowledge. And if, right, it's like, what are we testing for here? And this kind of gets to another kind of interesting hazard we need to be thinking about, not just as parents, but also as game designers and all of us involved in lifelong learning. What I think is quite interesting is actually the original founder of this company was a digital marketer who was, as self-claimed, extremely inspired by a book called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. This book has blown up in Silicon Valley. This is one of the big sort of
Interesting. The plot thickens.
this was a book read by many, many, many people. It was very influential in terms of how we built some of the big social media platforms. And he's actually quoted saying, by the way, his name is Johann Brand, Mr. Brand. He's quoted saying, we're using music, we're using timers and points, we're using emotional triggers. We're not just designing for the logical sense, but for the emotional side. Now, that can be really powerful in learning, right? Where we connect with what we actually feel. We remember what we actually feel. But the downside of that is, as you kind of were getting at, is this other methods of learning. Do we want our learning experiences to be ding, zzz, bong, that kind of, there, I think, are limits. There are pros and cons here. Obviously, in many ways, this blows something like PowerPoints out of the water in terms of engagement and exciting. But, there's another side of this where do we want our classrooms as game shows? Do we want that sort of flashy, fun trivia machine experience? How much do we want to lean on that as learning?
Right, especially as students really learn in different ways. They demonstrate their knowledge in different ways. So I really find that Kahoot, I absolutely could see the use cases, of course, but I don't think it's an equitable teaching tool. I really don't. Thinking about, emphasizing it, to your point, competitive versus cooperative learning, and overemphasizing quick recall.
And for those, students who struggle with reading, who maybe don't really get what the question is asking, who, guilty as charged, overanalyze from time to time, who maybe get really stressed in competitive environments or just don't get, this format or have other things going on and sort of externalities. This is all part of the broader environment for learning. Not to mention, what we talk about all the time on this podcast, things like the digital divide and how some of these inequities can be exacerbated or bridged with the result of these technologies.
Yeah, like that was one of the things that I was looking at as well. That one of the main complaints by students are technical problems, such as unreliable internet connections. And that made me think of the digital divide as well, is that tools like this are great, especially in distance learning, if you have a reliable internet connection. Could you imagine the stress that would impart on you as a student if you're in the middle of, a Kahoot where maybe you're online and a lot of kids are online, but maybe it's a hybrid environment where some kids are in person and your internet goes out, and then you have to explain that to your teacher, and then you can't, retake the quiz in the same format. I just can really see the problems that are exacerbated by a digital divide here.
Right. And, another thing, a little bit different than the digital divide, almost a kind of other side of the coin, Kahoot has struggled with bots. I don't know if you saw this, Jamie, but, and here we have not just some of the outside hackers, but actually students themselves who have flooded games.
Oh, yes. I have seen those. Yes, very funny.
Next generation of our technology builders are way more clever, the digital natives as they're called. But yeah, students are like flooding games with other users, posting on social media, come flood this game, having a bot to actually answer really, really quickly. So, Kahoot has responded with two-factor authentication, which has helped this. And they have made some, important, and they're a Norwegian company, but they operate globally. So they're generally speaking, have their compliance ducks in a row. COPA, GDPR, CCPA, some of the big international privacy regulations. They have this under wraps. Certainly on their website, there's pretty clear messaging around this. Now, that said, I did find something interesting. Common Sense Media is an organization in the US that looks at technology used by children and also provides all kinds of research and metrics and benchmarking. And they gave Kahoot a 66%.
I read that too.
Yeah. So when it comes to privacy, kids' privacy. So that's not the best score we can get. It's not the worst, but it's not the best.
Well, and to your point, too, of hackers, whether it be nefarious outside individuals or students, if you look at the score breakdown from Common Sense Privacy Program, protecting against unauthorized access was actually a 25 out of 100. I don't think that they had a poorer score than that.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. And it's coming from within the house in many cases, too.
The call is coming from inside the house.
Kahoot. All right. So what do we need to change here, Jamie? I mean, how can this improve? This is a strong platform. This is actually one of the biggest platforms we've talked about. They've grown considerably. But how do they address some of these hazards we're talking about?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that needs to be addressed that we both hit on is remembering that competition isn't the only way to learn. So I think that by no means can Kahoot be the only way that a teacher chooses to administer a test or a spot check on learning. I think there needs to be less of a focus on just timed trivia and more about general knowledge building. I mean, research does support those same claims. To your point, you touched on as well, Jess, that many studies show that cooperative learning, so working in teams, not working competitively, showcases many benefits over competitive learning. In addition to that, I do think that they need to get some things under control on their student data privacy. We touched a little bit on their policies in terms of the cybersecurity and whatnot, but we haven't talked about data sharing. That was their second to lowest score, was that they are not clear in terms of student data collection, sharing, and selling. So I think that you could run into many issues depending on the age of the student. I believe that their privacy practice, I'll double check after this and put a note in just in case, but I believe it's under 13. They do not collect, personally identifiable information, but over 13 that they do. So depending on the country that you're in, where you're using Kahoot, I think that's something that definitely needs to change. Now, thinking of the opportunities, though, without focusing just on some of the negatives here, I think that certain types of career training that you might be undergoing, or even college courses, where speed and agility are emphasized. So I'm thinking maybe customer service or service technicians or emergency scenarios. Fantastic to use a tool like Kahoot, where you do have to encourage that fast brain thinking. I think it's interesting, though, that we're focusing on Kahoot today, and just a couple episodes ago, we were talking about Clubhouse, both of which encourage, fast brain responses, and sometimes to the detriment of the users. What about you, Jess? What do you think needs to change?
Well, in some ways, I think that Kahoot has hit on something really important, and that is, exploring more this hybrid model. So what do I mean by that? Now, in many ways, this is a tool that is useful for teachers, to offer a different form of learning than just, standard didactic standing in front of the class, but also to see what piques student interests, what actually sticks. What is, can we have a safe moment for check-in? And I think this has been kind of an interesting use case for in pandemic times for distance learning, having a way to check in with students. You wouldn't think of Kahoot being used that way, but it's a safe form to take a temperature check. And from a hybrid perspective of, how do teachers best connect with different learning types, even though we talked about how quizzes and competitive learning and speed are really kind of narrow in that lane. There's a lot of different and interesting use cases opening up, albeit through sort of a quiz platform or a quiz format. Students are creating their own questions. This is actually one of the biggest growth parts of the platform. A lot of teachers love.
Oh, you're right. We didn't talk about that much. You're right.
Yeah, and that's so this is powerful. I mean, there's another kind of emerging, I think it's still in beta, but a new offering that they're launching called the Kahoot Academy. Okay, and they're framing this as more of an online community and knowledge platform. And you can kind of think of this as sort of an open source anyone, or not anyone, but actually verified contributors, verified educators, premium partners like National Geographic or, college professors or whatever, can submit high quality learning content, can build a profile for them as a verified educator, can, and different folks can join different communities. And so this is fresh. This is really different than certainly the curricula and the, educational institutional architecture and just how we advance through a learning process. This is fundamentally different. And so, offering more to this hybrid model of what education looks and feels like, how teachers connect with their students, for that matter, even in the enterprise setting, how, educators connect with employees. I'm really interested in what Kahoot is doing to just offer some kind of new formats and designs for that.
I like hearing about the academy too. That's a great point to bring up, because a lot of teachers have said that they feel challenged by the rigidity of Kahoot structure, in that they feel they can't really get deep answers from students because multiple choice questions are already hard enough to come up with, as well as thinking about a time structure. So the fact that they have these academies, this academy content they're producing, I think will really help to bridge that gap for teachers as well, which that's great to hear.
Yeah. Now, this is the educational technology sector, and EdTech in general is part of the grand experiment on the technology side that, the pandemic has really accelerated. In the tech space, there's sort of a common refrain these days, which is that this pandemic has accelerated many technology spaces about 5 to 10 years. It's actually not totally clear. Suffice to say, many of these emerging tech sectors have accelerated. Digital health, right, is another example of an area. We're all using Zoom a lot more and these kind of online collaboration tools a lot more. And EdTech is an obvious other example. But, we're also at this kind of threshold to see, okay, well, how much did we accelerate? And what has that accelerate done for the industry? So we are at this threshold, certainly in this country anyway, as districts are reopening for more in-person instruction. Billions of dollars are flowing into schools. Venture capitalists have already sunk tons more money into this space. Okay, now what? Is this the normalization of EdTech? What are the limits? What do we need in digital reliance, right? The grand experiment is never more underway, I think.
Especially when we examine EdTech at large. Honestly, I think Kahoot will be fine, though. Kahoot was developed prior to anything like this. Like I said earlier, in terms of an in-person tool to get students engaged and excited and sort of that game show environment. So I think that they're on a roadmap for success here, which probably brings us to ratings time. What do you think?
I think it's time, Jamie. It's time for ratings. All right. For our listeners, as a reminder, at the end of each show, we offer a rating to you to help innovators just put this into context. After all the hype, the hazards, the opportunities that we surface, we choose one of 4 areas. Trash. Do we need to explain what trash is, Jamie?
I don't think so. I think everyone knows what trash is.
Now, a flash it's a flash in the pan. It's hot now, but it's fleeting. It's going to fade over time or get, consolidated. Next is cash.
Cha-ching. Basically a moneymaker that's scalable.
Exactly. But not necessarily something really innovative.
Not really super innovative, right?
And then finally, the gold star, a splash. And this is something fundamentally new, fundamentally disruptive, that's actually solving a real problem. Business problem, societal problem, consumer problem, whatever. All right, Jamie, drum roll. What do we got?
I would say my rating is cash. And I know it might seem a little bit weird to say cash in the education sector. However, I think that ultimately I focused more on the fact that it's not super innovative to use quizzes to try to engage learners. I think it's incredibly scalable. We're already seeing that with hundreds of competitors to Kahoot already in the ed tech space. I think that school systems will choose the tool that is best for them, or tools that really integrate best with the other technologies they're using. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're using Zoom, then you might really like Kahoot compared to some other tools. So I think overall, it is a potential for a moneymaker, but ultimately nothing super innovative when I'm looking across the entire technology spectrum. What about you, Jess?
This one was a tough one for me, honestly. In the end, I landed on Flash. And I'll tell you why. As you said, although Kahoot has been around for some time, it's not as though it's enjoyed a sudden surge like Clubhouse or something. That said, the reason I say Flash is because when we think about the real potential for EdTech and for e-learning generally, for distance learning, there's a lot more here. There's a lot more to do. We didn't talk at all, and frankly, it's because Kahoot is not really doing some of these bigger use cases around adaptive learning, around really personalized learning, around those collective learning, around really focusing on emergent skills. And so I'm really interested, and that's where I see a lot of the big, longer term disruption, although I do think that Kahoot Academy is quite interesting. But ultimately, I see the longer term for this as either maybe they'll grow really wide, but for now, it's a very narrow lane. And so I'm going to give it a flash.
Especially with personalized learning, which I would love to do a future episode on. So stay tuned. We may tackle AI, automation, and learning in the future.
So that's all for us today. Thank you very much for joining us once again. Credit where credit is due. This podcast was edited by Randall Ward, and our theme music was composed by Adam Roskowitz. Check out kaleidoinsights.com for much more on this and all other technology topics. And that's it. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Until next time.
Bye-bye.